Deconstruction is a form of philosophical and literary analysis derived principally from Jacques Derrida's 1967 work of Grammatology. In the 1980s it designated more loosely a range of theoretical enterprises in diverse areas of the humanities and social sciences, including in addition to philosophy and literature law, anthropology, historiography, linguistics, sociolinguistics, psychoanalysis, political theory, feminism, and gay and lesbian studies. Deconstruction still has a major influence in the academe of continental Europe and South America, where continental philosophy is predominant, particularly in debates around ontology, epistemology, ethics, aesthetics, hermeneutics, and the philosophy of language. It also influenced architecture, music, art, and art criticism. A central premise of deconstruction is that all of Western literature and philosophy implicitly relies on a metaphysics of presence, where intrinsic meaning is accessible by virtue of pure presence. Deconstruction denies the possibility of a pure presence and thus of essential or intrinsic and stable meaning and thus a relinquishment of the notions of absolute truth, unmediated access to reality, and consequently of conceptual hierarchy. From the moment that there is meaning there are nothing but signs. We think only in signs. Language, considered as a system of signs, as Ferdinand de Saussure says, is nothing but differences. Words have meaning only because of contrast effects with other words. Red means what it does only by contrast with blue, green, etc. Being also means nothing except by contrast, not only with beings but with nature, God, humanity, and indeed every other word in the language. No word can acquire meaning in the way in which philosophers from Aristotle to Bertrand Russell have hoped it might by being the unmediated expression of something non-linguistic. Derrida terms logocentrism the philosophical commitment to pure, unmediated, presence as a source of self-sufficient meaning. Due to this impossibility of pure presence and consequently of intrinsic meaning, any given concept is constituted in reciprocal determination, in terms of its oppositions, for example perception reason, speech writing, mind-body, interior-exterior, marginal-central, sensible intelligible, intuition signification, nature-culture. Further, Derrida contends that in a classical philosophical opposition we are not dealing with the peaceful coexistence of a vis-à-vis, but rather with a violent hierarchy. One of the two terms governs the other, or has the upper hand signified over signifier. Intelligible over sensible. Speech over writing. Activity over passivity, etc. The first task of deconstruction, starting with philosophy and afterwards revealing it operating in literary texts, juridical texts, etc., would be to overturn these oppositions. But it is not that the final objective of deconstruction is to surpass all oppositions, because it is assumed they are structurally necessary to produce sense. They simply cannot be suspended once and for all. The hierarchy of dual oppositions always re-establishes itself. But this only points to the necessity of an interminable analysis that can make explicit the decisions and arbitrary violence intrinsic to all texts. Finally, Derrida argues that it is not enough to expose and deconstruct the way oppositions work and how meaning and values are produced, and then stop there in a nihilistic or cynical position regarding all meaning, thereby preventing any means of intervening in the field effectively. To be effective, deconstruction needs to create new terms, not to synthesize the concepts in opposition, but to mark their difference and eternal interplay. This explains why Derrida always proposes new terms in his deconstruction, not as a free play but as a pure necessity of analysis, to better mark the intervals. Derrida called undecidables, that is, unities of simulacrum, false verbal properties that can no longer be included within philosophical opposition, but which, however, inhabit philosophical oppositions, resisting and organizing it, without ever constituting a third term, without ever leaving room for a solution in the form of speculative dialectics. Etymology. Although he avoided defining the term directly, Derrida sought to apply Martin Heidegger's concept of destruction or abau, to textual reading. Heidegger's term referred to a process of exploring the categories and concepts that tradition has imposed on a word, and the history behind them. Derrida opted for deconstruction over the literal translation destruction to suggest precision rather than violence. Deconstruction is a form of anti-foundationalism and a critique of idealism. Deconstruction is within the Continental Euro as opposed to analytical Euro tradition of philosophy. On deconstruction, Derrida's approach to literary criticism, Derrida's method consisted in demonstrating all the forms and varieties of the originary complexity of semiotics, and their multiple consequences in many fields. His way of achieving this was by conducting thorough, careful, sensitive, and yet transformational readings of philosophical and literary texts, with an ear to what in those texts runs counter to their apparent systematicity or intended sense. By demonstrating the aporias and ellipses of thought, Derrida hoped to show the infinitely subtle ways that this originary complexity, which by definition cannot ever be completely known, works its structuring and destructuring effects. Deconstruction denotes the pursuing of the meaning of a text to the point of exposing the supposed contradictions and internal oppositions upon which it is founded, supposedly showing that those foundations are irreducibly complex, unstable, or impossible. It is an approach that may be deployed in philosophy, in literary analysis, and even in the analysis of scientific writings. Deconstruction generally tries to demonstrate that any text is not a discrete whole but contains several irreconcilable and contradictory meanings. That any text therefore has more than one interpretation. That the text itself links these interpretations inextricably. That the incompatibility of these interpretations is irreducible. And thus that an interpretative reading cannot go beyond a certain point. Derrida refers to this point as an aporia in the text. Thus, deconstructive reading is termed aporetic. He insists the meaning is made possible by the relations of a word to other words within the network of structures that language is. Derrida initially resisted granting to his approach the overarching name deconstruction, on the grounds that it was a precise technical term that could not be used to characterize his work generally. Nevertheless, he eventually accepted that the term had come into common use to refer to his textual approach, and Derrida himself increasingly began to use the term in this more general way. Basic philosophical concerns. Derrida unregistered trademark concerns flow from a consideration of several issues. 1. A desire to contribute to the revaluation of all Western values, built on the 18th-century Kantian critique of reason, and carried forward to the 19th century, in its more radical implications, by Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. 2. An assertion that texts outlive their authors, and become part of a set of cultural habits equal to, if not surpassing, the importance of authorial intent. 3. A revaluation of certain classic Western dialectics, poetry versus philosophy, reason versus revelation, structure versus creativity, episteme versus techne, etc. To this end, Derrida follows a long line of modern philosophers, who look backwards to Plato and his influence on the Western metaphysical tradition. Like Nietzsche, Derrida suspects Plato of dissimulation in the service of a political project, namely the education, through critical reflections, of a class of citizens more strategically positioned to influence the polis. However, like Nietzsche, Derrida is not satisfied merely with such a political interpretation of Plato, because of a particular dilemma modern humans find themselves stuck in. His Platonic reflections are inseparably part of his critique of modernity, hence the attempt to be something beyond the modern, because of this Nietzschean sense that the modern has lost its way and become mired in nihilism. Influence of Nietzsche. In order to understand Derrida unregistered trademark motivation, one must refer to Nietzsche's philosophy. Nietzsche's project began with Orpheus, the man underground. This foil to Platonic light was deliberately and self-consciously lauded in Daybreak, when Nietzsche announces, albeit retrospectively, in this work you will discover a subterranean man at work, and then goes on to map the project of unreason, all things that live long are gradually so saturated with reason that their origin in unreason thereby becomes improbable. Does not almost every precise history of an origination impress our feelings as paradoxical and wantonly offensive? Does the good historian not, at bottom, constantly contradict? a Euro unregistered trademark point and daybreak is that standing at the end of modern history, modern thinkers know too much to be deceived by the illusion of reason anymore. Reason, logic, philosophy and science are no longer solely sufficient as the royal roads to truth. And so Nietzsche decides to throw it in our faces, and uncover the truth of Plato, that he unlike Orpheus just happened to discover his true love in the light instead of in the dark. This being merely one historical event amongst many, Nietzsche proposes that we revisualize the history of the West as the history of a series of political moves, that is, a manifestation of the will to power, that at bottom have no greater or lesser claim to truth in any noumenal sense. By calling our attention to the fact that he has assumed the role of Orpheus, the man underground, in dialectical opposition to Plato, Nietzsche hopes to sensitize us to the political and cultural context, and the political influences that impact authorship. For example, the political influences that led one author to choose philosophy over poetry, and another to make a different choice. The problem with Nietzsche, as Derrida sees it, is that he did not go far enough. That he missed the fact that this will to power is itself but a manifestation of the operation of writing. And so Derrida wishes to help us step beyond Nietzsche's unregistered trademark's penultimate revaluation of all Western values, to the ultimate, which is the final appreciation of a role of writing in the production of knowledge, influence of Saussure. Derrida approaches all text as constructed around elemental oppositions which all discourse has to articulate if it intends to make any sense whatsoever. This is so because identity is viewed in non-essentialist terms as a construct, and because constructs only produce meaning through the interplay of difference inside a system of distinct signs. This approach to text is influenced by the semiology of Ferdinand de Saussure. Saussure is considered one of the fathers of structuralism when he explained that terms get their meaning in reciprocal determination with other terms inside language. In language there are only differences. Even more important, a difference generally implies positive terms between which the difference is set up. But in language there are only differences without positive terms. Whether we take the signified or the signifier, language has neither ideas nor sounds that existed before the linguistic system, but only conceptual and phonic differences that have issued from the system. The idea or phonic substance that a sign contains is of less importance than the other signs that surround it. A linguistic system is a series of differences of sound combined with a series of differences of ideas. But the pairing of a certain number of acoustical signs with as many cuts made from the mass thought engenders a system of values. Saussure explicitly suggested that linguistics was only a branch of a more general semiology, of a science of signs in general, being human codes only one among others. Nevertheless, in the end, as Derrida pointed out, he made of linguistics the regulatory model, and for essential, and essentially metaphysical, reasons had to privilege speech, and everything that links the sign to phone. Derrida will prefer to follow the more fruitful paths of a general semiotics without falling in what he considered a hierarchizing teleology privileging linguistics, and speak of mark rather than of language, not as something restricted to mankind, but as pre-linguistic, as the pure possibility of language, working everywhere there is a relation to something else. Differ copyright rants. Derrida sees the differences of language as elemental oppositions, working in all languages, all systems of distinct signs, all codes, where terms do not have an absolute meaning, but can only get it from reciprocal determination with the other terms. This structural difference is the first component that Derrida will take into account when coining the term differ copyright rants, an important term in deconstruction. 1. Differ copyright rants is the systematic play of differences, of the traces of differences, of the spacing by means of which elements are related to each other. This spacing is the simultaneously active and passive production of the intervals without which the full terms would not signify, would not function. But structural difference will not be considered without him already destabilizing from the start its static, synchronic, taxonomic, ahistoric motifs, remembering that all structure already refers to the generative movement in the play of differences. The other main component of differ copyright rants is differing, that takes into account the fact the meaning is not only a question of synchrony with all the other terms inside a structure, but also of diachrony, with everything that was said and will be said, in history, difference as structure and differing as genesis. 2. The A of differ copyright rants also recalls that spacing is temporization, the detour and postponement by means of which intuition, perception, consummation in a word, the relationship to the present, the reference to a present reality, to A being are always deferred. Deferred by virtue of the very principle of difference which holds that an element functions and signifies, takes on or conveys meaning, only by referring to another past or future element in an economy of traces. This economic aspect of differ copyright rants, which brings into play a certain not conscious calculation in a field of forces, is inseparable from the more narrowly semiotic aspect of differ copyright rants. This confirms the subject as not present to itself and constituted on becoming space, in temporizing, and also, as Saussure said, that language, which consists only of differences, is not a function of the speaking subject. Question this myth of the presence of meaning in itself and or for itself. Derrida will start a long deconstruction of all texts where conceptual oppositions are put to work in the actual construction of meaning and values based on the subordination of the movement of difference. At the point at which the concept of difference, and the chain attached to it, intervenes, all the conceptual oppositions of metaphysics to the extent that they ultimately refer to the presence of something present become non-pertinent. They all amount, at one moment or another, to a subordination of the movement of difference in favor of the presence of a value or a meaning supposedly antecedent to difference, more original than it, exceeding and governing it in the last analysis. This is still the presence of what we called above the transcendental signified. But, as Derrida also points out, these relations with other terms do not express only meaning but also values. The way elemental oppositions are put to work in all texts, it is not only a theoretical operation but also a practical option. The first task of deconstruction, starting with philosophy and afterwards revealing it operating in literary texts, juridical texts, etc., would be to overturn these oppositions. On the one hand, we must traverse a phase of overturning. To do justice to this necessity is to recognize that in a classical philosophical opposition we are not dealing with the peaceful coexistence of a vis-a-vis, but rather with a violent hierarchy. One of the two terms governs the other, or has the upper hand. To deconstruct the opposition, first of all, is to overturn the hierarchy at a given moment. To overlook this phase of overturning is to forget the conflictual and subordinating structure of opposition. It is not that the final task of deconstruction is to surpass all oppositions, because they're structurally necessary to produce sense. They simply cannot be suspended once and for all. But this does not mean that they do not need to be analyzed and criticized in all its manifestations, showing the way these oppositions, both logical and axiological, are at work in all discourse for it to be able to produce meaning and values. And it is not enough for deconstruction to expose the way oppositions work and how meaning and values are produced in speech of all kinds and stop there in a nihilistic or cynic position regarding all meaning, thereby preventing any means of intervening in the field effectively. To be effective, deconstruction needs to create new concepts, not to synthesize the terms in opposition, but to mark their difference and eternal interplay. That being said, and on the other hand to remain in this phase is still to operate on the terrain of and from within the deconstructed system. By means of this double, and precisely stratified, dislodged and dislodging, writing, we must also mark the interval between inversion, which brings low what was high, and the eruptive emergence of a new concept that no longer be, and never could be, included in the previous regime. If this interval, this biphase or biphase, can be inscribed only in a bifurcated writing, then it can only be marked in what I would call a group textual field. In the last analysis it is impossible to point it out, for a unilinear text, or a punctual position, an operation signed by a single author, are all by definition incapable of practicing this interval. This explains why Derrida always proposes new terms in his deconstruction, not as a free play but as a pure necessity of analysis, to better mark the intervals. Henceforth, in order better to mark this interval, it has been necessary to analyze, to set to work, within the text of the history of philosophy, as well as within a so-called literary text, certain marks, shall we say, that by analogy I have called undecidables, that is, unities of simulacrum, false verbal properties that can no longer be included within philosophical opposition, but which, however, inhabit philosophical oppositions, resisting and organizing it, without ever constituting a third term, without ever leaving room for a solution in the form of speculative dialectics. Some examples of these new terms created by Derrida clearly exemplify the deconstruction procedure. The pharmacan is neither remedy nor poison, neither good nor evil, neither the inside nor the outside, neither speech nor writing. The supplement is neither a plus nor a minus, neither an outside nor the complement of an inside, neither accident nor essence, etc. The hymen is neither confusion nor distinction, neither identity nor difference, neither consummation nor virginity, neither the veil nor unveiled, neither inside nor the outside, etc. The gram is neither a signifier nor a signified, neither a sign nor a thing, neither presence nor an absence, neither a position nor a negation, etc. Spacing is neither space nor time. The incision is neither the incised integrity of a beginning, or of a simple cutting into, nor simple secondary. Nevertheless, perhaps Derrida's most famous mark was, from the start, difference, created to deconstruct the opposition between speech and writing and open the way to the rest of his approach. And this holds first of all for a new concept of writing, that simultaneously provokes the overturning of the hierarchy speech-writing, and the entire system attached to it, and releases the dissonance of a writing within speech, thereby disorganizing the entire inherited order and invading the entire field. Illustration of differ copyright rants. For example, the word house derives its meaning more as a function of how it differs from shed, mansion, hotel, building, etc. than how the word house may be tied to a certain image of a traditional house, with each term being established in reciprocal determination with the other terms than by an ostensive description or definition. When can we talk about a house, or a mansion, or a shed? The same can be said about verbs. In all the languages in the world, when should we stop saying walk, and start saying run? The same happens, of course, with adjectives. When must we stop saying yellow, and start saying orange, or exchange past for present? Not only are the topological differences between the words relevant here, but the differentials between what is signified is also covered by differ copyright rants. Deferral also comes into play, as the words that occur following house in any expression will revise the meaning of that word, sometimes dramatically so. This is true not only with syntagmatic succession in relation with paradigmatic simultaneity, but also, in a broader sense, between diachronic succession in history related with synchronic simultaneity inside a system of distinct signs. Thus, complete meaning is always differential, and postponed in language. There is never a moment when meaning is complete and total. A simple example would consist of looking up a given word in a dictionary, then proceeding to look up the words found in that word's definition, etc., also comparing with older dictionaries from different periods in time, and such a process would never end. This is also true with all ontological oppositions and their many declensions, not only in philosophy as in human sciences in general, cultural studies, theory of law, etc. The intelligible and the sensible, the spontaneous and the receptive, autonomy and heteronomy, the empirical and the transcendental, immanent and transcendent, as the interior and exterior, or the founded and the founder, normal and abnormal, phonetic and writing, analysis and synthesis, the literal sense and figurative meaning in language, reason and madness in psychoanalysis, the masculine and feminine in gender theory, man and animal in ecology, the beast and the sovereign in the political field, theory and practice as distinct dominions of thought itself. In all speeches in fact we can make clear how they were dramatized, how the cleavages were made during the centuries, each author giving it different centers and establishing different hierarchies between the terms and the opposition. Derrida versus Hegel. Distinguish deconstruction from speculative dialectics. In the deconstruction procedure, one of the main concerns of Derrida is not to collapse into Hegel's dialectic where these oppositions would be reduced to contradictions in a dialectic whose telos would, necessarily, be to resolve it into a synthesis. The presence of Hegelianism was enormous in the intellectual life of France during the second half of the 20th century with the influence of Kojève and Hippolyte, but also with the impact of dialectics based on contradiction developed by Marxists, and including the existentialism from Sartre, etc. This explains Derrida's concern to always distinguish his procedure from Hegel's. Neither nor, that is simultaneously either or. The mark is also the marginal limit, the march, etc. In fact, I attempt to bring the critical operation to bear against the unceasing reappropriation of this work of the simulacrum by a dialectics of the Hegelian type, for Hegelian idealism consists precisely of a relief of the binary oppositions of classical idealism, a resolution of contradiction into a third term that comes in order to aufheben, to deny while raising up, while idealizing, while sublimating into an anamnesic interiority, while interning difference in a self-presence. This difference from Hegel should be understood as essential from the start, and the difference being one of the first terms that he tried more accurately to distinguish from all forms of Hegelian difference when proceeding with deconstruction. Since it is still a question of elucidating the relationship to Hegel, a difficult labor, which for the most part remains before us, and which in a certain way is from Hegelian difference, and have done so precisely at the point at which Hegel, in the greater logic, determines difference as contradiction only in order to resolve it, to interiorize it, to lift it up into the self-presence of an ontotheological or ontoteleological synthesis. More than difference is the conflictuality of difference that must be distinguished from contradiction in Hegel to clearly distinguish deconstruction from speculative dialectics. Difference must sign the point at which one breaks with the system of the Aufhebung and with speculative dialectics. Since this conflictuality of difference which can be called contradiction only if one demarcates it by means of a long work on Hegel's concept of contradiction, can never be totally resolved, it marks its effects in what I call the text in general, in a text which is not reduced to a book or a library, and which can never be governed by a referent in the classical sense, that is, by a thing or by a transcendental signified that would regulate its movement. You can well see that it is not because I wish to appease or reconciliate, that I prefer to employ the mark difference rather than refer to the system of difference and contradiction. I currently here is no outside text. There is one statement by Derrida which has been of great interest to his opponents, and which appeared in an essay on Rousseau. It is the assertion that there is no outside text, which is often mistranslated as there is nothing outside of the text. The mistranslation is often used to suggest Derrida believes that nothing exists but words. Michel Foucault, for instance, famously misattributed to Derrida the very different phrase "il n'a rien dire du texte" for this purpose. According to Derrida, his statement simply refers to the unavoidability of context. We can call context the entire real history of the world, if you like, in which this value of objectivity and, even more broadly, that of truth have taken on meaning and imposed themselves. That does not in the slightest discredit them. In the name of what, of which other truth, moreover, would it? One of the definitions of what is called deconstruction would be the effort to take this context into account, to pay the sharpest and broadest attention possible to context, and thus to an incessant movement of recontextualization. The phrase which for some has become a sort of slogan, in general so badly understood, of deconstruction, means nothing else, there is nothing outside context. In this form, which says exactly the same thing, the formula would doubtless have been less shocking. I am not certain that it would have provided more to think about. Critics of Derrida have countless times quoted it as a slogan to characterize and stigmatize deconstruction. Some commentators have said that it means that it is not possible to think outside of the philosophical system, or that there is no experience of reality outside of language. With regards to the broadness of the concept of text, he added, I take great interest in questions of language and rhetoric, and I think they deserve enormous consideration. But there is a point where the authority of final jurisdiction is neither rhetorical nor linguistic, nor even discursive. The notion of trace or of text is introduced to mark the limits of the linguistic turn. This is one more reason why I prefer to speak of mark rather than of language. In the first place, the mark is not anthropological. It is pre-linguistic. it is the possibility of language, and it is everywhere there is a relation to another thing or relation to another. For such relations, the mark has no need of language. Deconstructing normality in analytical philosophy. A sequence of encounters with analytical philosophy is collected in Limited Incorporated, having Austin and Searle as the main interlocutors. Derrida would argue there about the problem he found in the constant appeal to normality in the analytical tradition from which Austin and Searle were only paradigmatic examples. His deconstruction there of the structure called normal is in many ways paradigmatic of his approach. In the description of the structure called normal, normative, central, ideal, this possibility of transgression must be integrated as an essential possibility. The possibility of transgression cannot be treated as though it were a simple accident marginal or parasitic. It cannot be, and hence ought not to be, and this passage from Kant to ought reflects the entire difficulty. In the analysis of so-called normal cases, one neither can nor ought, in all theoretical rigor, to exclude the possibility of transgression. Not even provisionally, or out of allegedly methodological considerations. It would be a poor method, since this possibility of transgression tells us immediately and indispensably about the structure of the act said to be normal as well as about the structure of law in general. He continued arguing how problematic it was establishing the relation between normal, non-fiction or standard discourse, and fiction, defined as its parasite, for part of the most originary essence of the latter is to allow fiction, the simulacrum, parasitism, to take place and in so doing to de-essentialize itself as it he would finally argue that the indispensable question would then become: what is non-fiction standard discourse, what must it be and what does this name evoke, once its fictionality or its fictionalization, its transgressive parasitism, is always possible? This question is all the more indispensable since the rules, and even the statements of the rules governing the relations of non-fiction standard discourse, and its fictional parasites, are not things found in nature, but laws, symbolic inventions, or conventions, institutions that, in their very normality as well as in their normativity, entail something of the fictional. This dispute is well configured by Umberto Eco when, exposing the example of divergences about the concept of denotation in Stolpmill and Jumsiliv, concluded: the reason for the confusions is not accidental, nor Esperanto full of goodwill will be able to solve it. It is that the semiotic thought presents itself, from the beginning, as always divided by a dilemma and marked by a choice, more or less implicit, that guides the thinker. Is it his task when studying languages to know when and how to refer to things properly or to ask how and when they are used to produce beliefs? Or, downstream of any terminological choice, there is a deeper choice between transparent systems of signification about things or systems of signification as producers of reality. Pathetic confidentiality of this division, the two sides of the fence, when the division is manifested, rate the opponent as idealist. The difficulty of definition and Derrida's negative descriptions, when asked, what is deconstruction? Derrida replied, I have no simple and formalizable response to this question. All my essays are attempts to have it out with this formidable question. Derrida believes that deconstruction is necessarily complicated and difficult to explain since it actively criticizes the very language needed to explain it. Derrida's defenders argue that in giving this reply, Derrida was simply being consistent. The word deconstruction is as slippery as any other word in the dictionary. Others criticize Derrida for being unable to define the discipline that he himself created, and for being evasive about it. Derrida has been more forthcoming with negative than positive descriptions of deconstruction. When asked by Toshihiko Izutsu some preliminary considerations on how to translate deconstruction in Japanese, in order to at least prevent going contrary to its actual meaning, Derrida therefore began his response by saying that such question amounts to, what deconstruction is not, or rather ought not to be. Derrida states that deconstruction is not an analysis, a critique, or a method in the traditional sense that philosophy understands these terms. In these negative descriptions of deconstruction, Derrida is seeking to multiply the cautionary indicators and put aside all the traditional philosophical concepts. This does not mean that deconstruction has absolutely nothing in common with an analysis, a critique, or a method because while Derrida distances deconstruction from these terms, he reaffirms the necessity of returning to them, at least under erasure. Derrida's necessity of returning to a term under erasure means that even though these terms are problematic we must use them until they can be effectively reformulated or replaced. Derrida's thought developed in relation to Husserl's, and this return to something under erasure has a similarity to Husserl's phenomenological reduction or epocha copyright. Derrida acknowledges that his preference for negative description has been called a type of negative theology. The relevance of the tradition of negative theology to Derrida's preference for negative descriptions of deconstruction is the notion that a positive description of deconstruction would overdetermine the idea of deconstruction, and that this would be a mistake because it would close off the openness that Derrida wishes to preserve for deconstruction. This means that if Derrida were to positively define deconstruction as, for example, a critique, then this would put the concept of critique forever outside the possibility of deconstruction. Some new philosophy beyond deconstruction would then be required in order to surpass the notion of critique. Not a method. Derrida states that deconstruction is not a method, and cannot be transformed into one. This is because deconstruction is not a mechanical operation. Derrida warns against considering deconstruction as a mechanical operation when he states that it is true that in certain circles the technical and methodological metaphor that seems necessarily attached to the very word deconstruction has been able to seduce or lead astray. Commentator Richard Beardsworth explains that Derrida is careful to avoid this term, method, because it carries connotations of a procedural form of judgment. A thinker with a method has already decided how to proceed, is unable to give him or herself up to the matter of thought in hand, is a functionary of the criteria which structure his or her conceptual gestures. For Derrida, this is irresponsibility itself. Thus, to talk of a method in relation to deconstruction, especially regarding its ethico-political implications, would appear to go directly against the current of Derrida's philosophical adventure. Beardsworth here explains that it would be irresponsible to undertake a deconstruction with a complete set of rules that need only be applied as a method to the object of deconstruction, because this understanding would reduce deconstruction to a thesis of the reader that the text is then made to fit. This would be an irresponsible act of reading because it ignores the empirical facticity of the text itself. That is, it becomes a prejudicial procedure that only finds what it sets out to find. To be responsible, a deconstruction must carefully negotiate the empirical facticity of the text and hence respond to it. Deconstruction is not a method, and this means that it is not a neat set of rules that can be applied to any text in the same way. Deconstruction is therefore not neatly transcendental because it cannot be considered separate from the contingent empirical facticity of the particular texts that any deconstruction must carefully negotiate. Each deconstruction is necessarily different, and this is why Derrida states that deconstruction takes place. It is an event. On the other hand, deconstruction cannot be completely untranscendental because this would make it meaningless to, for example, speak of two different examples of deconstruction as both being examples of deconstruction. It is for this reason that Richard Rorty asks if Derrida should be considered a quasi-transcendental philosopher that operates in the tension between the demands of the empirical and the transcendental. Each example of deconstruction must be different, but it must also share something with other examples of deconstruction. Deconstruction is therefore not a method in the traditional sense, but is what Derrida terms an unclosed, uninclusible, not wholly formalizable ensemble of rules for reading, interpretation and writing. Not a critique. Derrida states that deconstruction is not a critique in the Kantian sense. This is because Kant defines the term critique as the opposite of dogmatism. For Derrida, it is not possible to escape the dogmatic baggage of the language we use in order to perform a pure critique in the Kantian sense. For Derrida, language is dogmatic because it is inescapably metaphysical. Derrida argues that language is inescapably metaphysical because it is made up of signifiers that only refer to that which transcends them, the signified. This transcending of the empirical facticity of the signifier by an ideally conceived signified is metaphysical. It is metaphysical in the sense that it mimics the understanding in Aristotle's metaphysics of an ideally conceived being as that which transcends the existence of every individually existing thing. In a less formal version of the argument, it might be noted that it is impossible to use language without asserting being, and hence metaphysics, constantly through the use of the various modifications of the verb to be. In addition, Derrida asks rhetorically, is not the idea of knowledge and of the acquisition of knowledge in itself metaphysical? By this, Derrida means that all claims to know something necessarily involve an assertion of the metaphysical type that something is the case somewhere. For Derrida, the concept of neutrality is suspect and dogmatism is therefore involved in everything to a certain degree. Deconstruction can challenge a particular dogmatism and hence dissediment dogmatism in general, but it cannot escape all dogmatism all at once. Not in analysis, Derrida states that deconstruction is not in analysis in the traditional sense. This is because the possibility of analysis is predicated on the possibility of breaking up the text being analyzed into elemental component parts. Derrida argues that there are no self-sufficient units of meaning in a text. This is because individual words or sentences in a text can only be properly understood in terms of how they fit into the larger structure of the text and language itself. For more on Derrida's theory of meanings, see the page on Differ Copyright Rants. Not post-structuralist, Derrida states that his use of the word deconstruction first took place in a context in which structuralism was dominant, and its use is related to this context. Derrida states that deconstruction is an anti-structuralist gesture, because structures were to be undone, decomposed, desedimented. At the same time, for Derrida, deconstruction is also a structuralist gesture, because it is concerned with the structure of texts. So for Derrida, deconstruction involves a certain attention to structures, and tries to understand how an ensemble was constituted. As both a structuralist and an anti-structuralist gesture, deconstruction is tied up with what Derrida calls the structural problematic. The structural problematic for Derrida is the tension between genesis, that which is in the essential mode of creation or movement, and structure, systems, or complexes, or static configurations. An example of genesis would be the sensory ideas from which knowledge is then derived in the empirical epistemology. An example of structure would be a binary opposition such as good and evil, where the meaning of each element is established, at least partly, through its relationship to the other element. For Derrida, genesis and structure are both inescapable modes of description. There are some things that must be described in terms of structure, and others which must be described in terms of genesis, but these two modes of description are difficult to reconcile, and this is the tension of the structural problematic. In Derrida's own words, the structural problematic is that beneath the serene use of these concepts, genesis and structure is to be found a debate that makes new reductions and explications indefinitely necessary. The structural problematic is therefore what propels philosophy and hence deconstruction forward. Another significance of the structural problematic for Derrida is that while a critique of structuralism is a recurring theme of his philosophy, this does not mean that philosophy can claim to be able to discard all structural aspects. It is for this reason that Derrida distances his use of the term deconstruction from post-structuralism, a term that would suggest philosophy could simply go beyond structuralism. Derrida states that a motif of deconstruction has been associated with post-structuralism, but that this term was a word unknown in France until its return from the United States. Derrida's deconstruction of Husserl. Derrida actually argues for the contamination of pure origins by the structures of language and temporality, and Manfred Frank has even referred to Derrida's work as neo-structuralism. Alternative definitions. The popularity of the term deconstruction combined with the technical difficulty of Derrida's primary material on deconstruction and his reluctance to elaborate his understanding of the term has meant that many secondary sources have attempted to give a more straightforward explanation than Derrida himself ever attempted. Secondary definitions are therefore an interpretation of deconstruction by the person offering them rather than a direct summary of Derrida's actual position. Paul de Man was a member of the Yale School and a prominent practitioner of deconstruction as he understood it. His definition of deconstruction is that, it is possible, within text, to frame a question or undo assertions made in the text, by means of elements which are in the text, which frequently would be precisely structures that play off the rhetorical against grammatical elements. Richard Rorty was a prominent interpreter of Derrida's philosophy. His definition of deconstruction is that, the term deconstruction refers in the first instance to the way in which the accidental features of a text can be seen as betraying, subverting, its purportedly essential message. John D. Capito attempts to explain deconstruction in a nutshell by stating, whenever deconstruction finds a nutshell a secure axiom or a pithy maxima the very idea is to crack it open and disturb this tranquility. Indeed, that is a good rule of thumb in deconstruction. That is what deconstruction is all about, its very meaning and mission, if it has any. One might even say that cracking nutshells is what deconstruction is. In a nutshell, have we not run up against a paradox and an aporia, something contradictory? The paralysis and impossibility of an aporia is just what impels deconstruction, what rouses it out of bed in the morning. Niall Lucy points to the impossibility of defining the term at all, stating, while in a sense it is impossibly difficult to define, the impossibility has less to do with the adoption of a position or the assertion of a choice on deconstruction a unregistered trademark as part than with the impossibility of every ICE unregistered trademark as such. Deconstruction begins, as it were, from a refusal of the authority or determining power of every ICE unregistered trademark, or simply from a refusal of authority in general. While such refusal may indeed count as a position, it is not the case that deconstruction holds this as a sort of a preference unregistered trademark. David B. Allison is an early translator of Derrida and states in the introduction to his translation of Speech and Phenomena, deconstruction signifies a project of critical thought whose task is to locate and take apart those concepts which serve as the axioms or rules for a period of thought, those concepts which command the unfolding of an entire epoch of metaphysics. Deconstruction is somewhat less negative than the Heideggerian or Nietzschean terms destruction or reversal. It suggests that certain foundational concepts of metaphysics will never be entirely eliminated. There is no simple overcoming of metaphysics or the language of metaphysics. Paul Ricoeur defines deconstruction as a way of uncovering the questions behind the answers of a text or tradition. Richard Ellman defines deconstruction as the systematic undoing of understanding. A survey of the secondary literature reveals a wide range of heterogeneous arguments. Particularly problematic are the attempts to give neat introductions to deconstruction by people trained in literary criticism who sometimes have little or no expertise in the relevant areas of philosophy that Derrida is working in relation to. These secondary works have attempted to explain deconstruction while being academically criticized as too far removed from the original texts and Derrida's actual position. In an effort to clarify the rather muddled reception of the term deconstruction, Derrida specifies what deconstruction is not through a number of negative definitions. Related works by Derrida, antecedent example, the phenomenology versus structuralism debate. Before coining the term deconstruction, Derrida began speaking and writing publicly at a time when the French intellectual scene was experiencing an increasing rift between what could broadly be called phenomenological and structural approaches to understanding individual and collective life. For those with a more phenomenological bent, the goal was to understand experience by comprehending and describing its genesis, the process of its emergence from an origin or event. For the structuralists, this was a problematic and misleading avenue of interrogation, and the depth and originality of experience could in fact only be an effect of structures which are not themselves experiential. It is in this context that in 1959 Derrida asks the question, must not structure have a genesis, and must not the origin, the point of genesis, be already structured in order to be the genesis of something? In other words, every structural or synchronic phenomenon has a history, and the structure cannot be understood without understanding its genesis. At the same time, in order that there be movement, or potential, the origin cannot be some pure unity or simplicity, but must already be articulated complex such that from it a diachronic process can emerge. This originary complexity must not be understood as an original positing, but more like a default of origin, which Derrida refers to as iterability, inscription, or textuality. It is this thought of originary complexity, rather than original purity, which destabilizes the thought of both genesis and structure, that sets Derrida's work in motion, and from which derive all of its terms, including deconstruction. Differ copyright rants. Crucial to Derrida's work is the concept of differ copyright rants, a complex term which refers to the process of the production of difference and deferral. According to Derrida, all difference and all presence arise from the operation of differ copyright rants. Differ copyright rants is an infinitesimal difference that is not only a difference that is non-dualistic, but also it is a difference that is undecidable. To deconstruct philosophy is to think carefully within philosophy about philosophical concepts in terms of their structure and genesis. Deconstruction questions the appeal to presence by arguing that there is always an irreducible aspect of non-presence in operation. Derrida terms this aspect of non-presence differ copyright rants. Differ copyright rants is therefore the key theoretical basis of deconstruction. Deconstruction questions the basic operation of all philosophy through the appeal to presence and differ copyright rants. Derrida argues that differ copyright rants pervades all philosophy because, what defers presence is the very basis on which presence is announced or desired and what represents it, its sign, its trace. Differ copyright rants therefore pervades all philosophy because all philosophy is constructed as a system through language. Differ copyright rants is essential to language because it produces, what metaphysics calls the sign. In one sense, a sign must point to something beyond itself that is its meaning, so the sign is never fully present in itself but a deferral to something else, to something different. In another sense, the structural relationship between the signified and signifier, as two related but separate aspects of the sign, is produced through differentiation. Derrida states that differ copyright rants is the economical concept, meaning that it is the concept of all systems and structures, because there is no economy without differ copyright rants. The movement of differ copyright rants, as that which produces different things, that which differentiates, is the common root of all the oppositional concepts that mark our language. Differ copyright rants is also the production of these differences. Differ copyright rants is therefore the condition of possibility for all complex systems and hence all philosophy. Operating through differ copyright rants, deconstruction is the description of how non-presence problematizes the operation of the appeal to presence within a particular philosophical system. Differ copyright rants is an a priori condition of possibility that is always already in effect, but a deconstruction must be a careful description of how this differ copyright rants is actually in effect in a given text. Deconstruction therefore describes problems in the text rather than creating them. Derrida considers the illustration of aporia in this way to be productive because it shows the failure of earlier philosophical systems and the necessity of continuing to philosophize through them with deconstruction. Of grammatology. Derrida first employs the term deconstruction in Of Grammatology in 1967 when discussing the implications of understanding language as writing rather than speech. Here Derrida introduces deconstruction to describe the manner that understanding language as or writing renders infeasible a straightforward semantic theory. Derrida states that writing thus enlarged and radicalized, no longer issues from a logos. Further, it inaugurates the destruction, not the demolition but the desedimentation, the deconstruction, of all the significations that have their source in that of the logos. In this quotation Derrida states that deconstruction is what happens to meaning when language is understood as writing. For Derrida, when language is understood as writing it is realized the meaning does not originate in the logos or thought of the language user. Instead, individual language users are understood to be using an external system of signs, a system that exists separately to them because these signs are written down. The meaning of language does not originate in the thoughts of the individual language user because those thoughts are already taking place in a language that does not originate with them. Individual language users operate within a system of meaning that is given to them from outside. Meaning is therefore not fully under the control of the individual language user. The meaning of a text is not neatly determined by authorial intention and cannot be recreated without problem by a reader. Meaning necessarily involves some degree of interpretation, negotiation, or translation. This necessity for the active interpretation of meaning by readers when language is understood as writing is why deconstruction takes place. To understand this more fully, consider the difference for Derrida between understanding language as speech and as writing. Derrida argues that people have historically understood speech as the primary mode of language and understood writing as an inferior derivative of speech. Derrida argues that speech is historically equated with logos, meaning thought, and associated with the presence of the speaker to the listener. It is as if the speaker thinks out loud and the listener hears what the speaker is thinking, and if there is any confusion then the speaker's presence allows them to qualify the meaning of a previous statement. Derrida argues that by understanding speech as thought, language effaces itself. Language itself is forgotten. The signified meaning of speech is so immediately understood that it is easy to forget that there are linguistic signifiers involved. But these signifiers are the spoken sounds and written marks that actually comprise language. Derrida therefore associates speech with a very straightforward and unproblematic theory of meaning and with the forgetting of the signifier and hence language itself. Derrida contrasts the understanding of language as speech with an understanding of language as writing. Unlike a speaker, a writer is usually absent and the reader cannot rely on the writer to clarify any problems that there might be with the meaning of the text. The consideration of language as writing leads inescapably to the insight that language is a system of signs. As a system of signs the signifiers are present but the signification can only be inferred. There is effectively an act of translation involved in extracting a signification from the signifiers of language. This act of translation is so habitual to language users that they must step back from their experience of using language in order to fully realize its operation. The significance of understanding language as writing rather than speech is that signifiers are present in language but significations are absent. To decide what words mean is therefore an act of interpretation. The insight that language is a system of signs, most obvious in the consideration of language as writing, leads Derrida to state that everything gathered under the name of language is beginning to let itself be transferred to the name of writing. This means that there is no room for the naive theory of meaning and forgetting of the signifier that previously existed when language was understood as speech. Later in his career, in 1980, Derrida retrospectively confirmed the importance of his observation on the devaluation of writing, which proved valid not only for classics of philosophy and the socio-historical totality of our civilization, but also for the deconstruction of a variety of modern scientific texts in linguistics, in anthropology, in psychoanalysis. Everywhere in these texts, such devaluation of writing showed to be insistent, repetitive, even obscurely compulsive, and the sign of a whole set of long-standing constraints. These constraints were practiced at the price of contradictions, of denials, of dogmatic decrees. Here Derrida states that deconstruction exposes historical constraints within the whole history of philosophy that have been practiced at the price of contradictions, denials, and dogmatic decrees. The unmasking of how contradictions, denials, and dogmatic decrees are at work in a given text is closely associated with deconstruction. The careful illustration of how such problems are inescapable in a given text can lead someone to describe the text as deconstructed. Speech and Phenomena. Derrida's first book-length Deconstruction is his critical engagement with Husserl's Phenomenology in Speech and Phenomena published in 1967. Derrida states that Speech and Phenomena is the essay I value the most, and it is therefore a very important example of deconstruction. Husserl's philosophy is grounded in conscious experience as the ultimate origin of validity for all philosophy and science. Derrida's deconstruction operates by illustrating how the originary status of consciousness is compromised by the operation of structures within conscious experience that prevent it from being the original self giving evidence, the present or presence of sense to a full and primordial intuition. Derrida argues that Husserl's phenomenology seems to us tormented, if not contested from within, by its own descriptions of the movement of temporalization and language. Derrida argues that the involvement of language and temporalization within the living present of conscious experience means that instead of consciousness being the pure unitary origin of validity that Husserl wishes it be, it is compromised by the operation of differ copyright rants in the structures of language and temporalization. Derrida argues that language is a structured system of signs and that the meanings of individual signs are produced by the different copyright rights between that sign and other signs. This means that words are not self-sufficiently meaningful but only meaningful as part of a larger structure that makes meaning possible. Derrida therefore argues that the meaning of language is dependent on the larger structures of language and cannot originate in the unity of conscious experience. Derrida therefore argues that linguistic meaning does not originate in the intentional meaning of the speaking subject. This conclusion is very important for deconstruction and explains the importance of speech and phenomena for Derrida. Informed by this conclusion, the deconstruction of a text will typically demonstrate the inability of the author to achieve their stated intentions within a text by demonstrating how the meaning of the language they use is, at least partially, beyond the ability of their intentions to control. Similarly, Derrida argues that Husserl's description of temporal consciousness where he describes the retention of past conscious experience and pretension of future conscious experience introduces the structural copyright grants of temporal deferral, temporal non-presence, into consciousness. This means that the past and future are not in the living present of conscious experience but they taint the presence of the living present with their conscious absence through retention and pretension. Husserl's description of temporal consciousness therefore compromises the total self-presence of conscious experience required by Husserl's philosophy once again. Writing and Difference. Writing and Difference is a collection of essays published by Derrida in 1967. Each essay is a critical negotiation by Derrida of texts by philosophical or literary writers. These essays have come to be termed deconstructions even though some of them were written before Derrida's first use of the term in of Grammatology. For example, the chapter Cogito in the History of Madness, dating from 1963, has been referred to as a deconstruction of the work of Michel Foucault, yet the term deconstruction does not actually appear in the chapter. Derrida's later work, while Derrida's deconstructions in the 1960s and 1970s were frequently concerned with the major philosophical systems, in his later work he is often concerned to demonstrate the aporias of specific terms and concepts, including forgiveness, hospitality, friendship, the gift, responsibility and cosmopolitanism. Development. After Derrida, authors other than Derrida have also used the term deconstructionism with different definitions. The Yale School. Between the late 1960s and the early 1980s many thinkers were influenced by deconstruction, including Paul de Man, Jeffrey Hartman, and J. Hillis Miller. This group came to be known as the Yale School and was especially influential in literary criticism. Several of these theorists were subsequently affiliated with the University of California, Irvine. Miller has described deconstruction this way: OE deconstruction is not a dismantling of the structure of a text, but a demonstration that it has already dismantled itself. Its apparently solid ground is no rock, but thin air. Critical legal studies movement. Arguing that law and politics cannot be separated, the founders of critical legal studies movement found necessary to criticize its absence at the level of theory. To demonstrate the indeterminacy of legal doctrine, these scholars often adopt a method, such as structuralism in linguistics or deconstruction in Continental philosophy, to make explicit the deep structure of categories and tensions at work in legal texts and talk. The aim was to deconstruct the tensions and procedures by which they are constructed, expressed, and deployed. For example, Duncan Kennedy, in explicit reference to semiotics and deconstruction procedures, maintains that various legal doctrines are constructed around the binary pairs of opposed concepts, each of which with a claim upon intuitive and formal forms of reasoning that must be made explicit, not only in their meaning but also its relative value, and criticized. Self and other, private and public, subjective and objective, freedom and control are examples of such pairs demonstrating the influence of this opposing concepts on the development of legal doctrines through history. Deconstructing history, deconstructive readings of history and sources have changed the entire discipline of history. In Deconstructing History, Alun Munslow examines history in what he argues is a postmodern age. He provides an introduction to the debates and issues of postmodernist history. He also surveys the latest research into the relationship between the past, history, and historical practice, as well as forwarding his own challenging theories. The inoperative community. Jean-Luc Nancy argues in his 1982 book The Inoperative Community for an understanding of community and society that is undeconstructible because it is prior to conceptualization. Nancy's work is an important development of deconstruction because it takes the challenge of deconstruction seriously and attempts to develop an understanding of political terms that is undeconstructible and therefore suitable for a philosophy after Derrida. The Ethics of Deconstruction. Simon Critchley argues in his 1992 book The Ethics of Deconstruction that Derrida's deconstruction is an intrinsically ethical practice. Critchley argues that deconstruction involves an openness to the other that makes it ethical in the Levinasian understanding of the term. Derrida and the political. Jacques Derrida has had a huge influence on contemporary political theory and political philosophy. Derrida's thinking has inspired Slavoj Zizek, Richard Rorty, Ernesto Laclais, Judith Butler and many more contemporary theorists developed a deconstructive approach to politics. Because deconstruction examines the internal logic of any given text or discourse, it helped many authors to analyze the contradictions inherent in all schools of thought, and as such it has proved revolutionary in political analysis, particularly ideology critiques. Richard Beardsworth, developing on Critchley's Ethics of Deconstruction, argues in his 1996 Derrida and the Political that deconstruction is an intrinsically political practice. He further argues that the future of deconstruction faces a choice between a theological approach and a technological approach represented first of all by the work of Bernard Stiegler. Influences. Derrida's theories on deconstruction were themselves influenced by the work of linguists such as Ferdinand de Saussure and literary theorists such as Roland Barthes. Derrida's views on deconstruction stood opposed to the theories of structuralists such as psychoanalytic theorist Jacques Lacan, linguist Claude Lévi-Strauss, and political and social theorist Michel Foucault. However, Derrida resisted attempts to label his work as post-structuralist. Criticisms. Derrida has been involved in a number of high-profile disagreements with prominent philosophers including Michel Foucault, John Searle, Willard Van Orman Quine, Peter Kreeft, and Jawan Gen Habermas. Most of the criticism of deconstruction were first articulated by these philosophers and repeated elsewhere. Michel Foucault was the subject of Derrida's early paper Cogito in the History of Madness, in which Derrida makes the controversial claim that in this 673-page book, Michel Foucault devotes 3 pages and, moreover, in a kind of prologue to his second chapter to a certain passage from the first of Descartes' Meditations. In alleging correctly or incorrectly, as will be determined that the sense of Foucault's entire project can be pinpointed in these few elusive and somewhat enigmatic pages, and that the reading of Descartes and the Cartesian cogito proposed to us engages in its problematic the totality of this history of madness. The audacity of Derrida's claim to problematize the whole of the history of madness by working with such a small section of the text outraged Foucault. Foucault responds in the new preface to the 1972 edition of the History of Madness by complaining that after the initial publication of the text, fragments of it pass into circulation and are passed off as the real thing. This comment may form the basis of the allegation that deconstruction does not adhere to conventional academic standards by failing to deal substantially with the texts it appears to criticize. Foucault also states in the appendix to the 1972 edition titled My Body, This Paper, This Fire that Derrida's deconstruction is a historically well-determined little pedagogy, which manifests itself here in a very visible manner. A pedagogy which teaches the student that there is nothing outside the text, but that in it, in its interstices, in its blanks and silences, the reserve of the origin reigns. That it is never necessary to look beyond it, but that here, not in the words of course, but in words as crossings out, in their lattice, what is said is the meaning of being. A pedagogy that inversely gives to the voice of the masters that unlimited sovereignty that allows it indefinitely to re-say the text. This rebuke by Foucault caused a rift between the two thinkers and they did not speak to each other for 10 years. Foucault refers in this passage to certain claims that Derrida makes in of grammatology, though without quotation or citation to indicate that he is doing so. Foucault's mention of crossings outs refers to the return to problematic terms under erasure. Foucault also alludes critically to the problematization of presence in deconstruction as a reading of what is not there in the text. This aspect of Foucault's argument may have encouraged Derrida to strongly emphasize the importance of fidelity to the text being deconstructed. Foucault's reference to Derrida's assertion that there is nothing outside the text is the basis of much criticism of deconstruction as being nihilistic, relativistic, apolitical, or confined to the ivory tower of academia. In fact, this infamous quote is subtly but essentially mistranslated, and literally reads "there is no outside text," or, as Derrida himself paraphrased it in Limited Incorporated, "there is nothing outside context." Thus, Derrida does not argue that only what is written in the text is relevant to it, but rather that no text can or should be interpreted without considering the various external factors that contributed to its production. At the same time, according to Derrida, these allegedly external phenomena need to be considered as historically contingent rather than as immutable and inevitable facts of life. John Searle, Derrida wrote Signature Event Context, a paper in which he critically engages with Austin's analytic philosophy of language. John Searle is a prominent supporter of Austin's philosophy and objected to the low level of philosophical argumentation, the deliberate obscurantism of the prose, the wildly exaggerated claims, and the constant striving to give the appearance of profundity by making claims that seem paradoxical, but under analysis often turn out to be silly or trivial. In 1983, Searle told to the New York Review of Books a remark on Derrida allegedly made by Michel Foucault in a private conversation with Searle himself. Searle's quote was, "Michel Foucault once characterized Derrida's prose style to me as obscurantism terrorist. The text is written so obscurely that you can't figure out exactly what the thesis is, and when one criticizes it, the author says, 'This m'avez mal compris. Vous êtes idiot.'" In 1988, Derrida wrote afterward, Toward an Ethic of Discussion, to be published with the previous essays in the collection Limited Incorporated. Commenting this critics in a footnote, he questioned, "I just want to raise the question of what precisely a philosopher is doing when, in a newspaper with a large circulation, he finds himself compelled to cite private and unverifiable insults of another philosopher in order to authorize himself to insult in turn and to practice what in French is called a jugement d'autorité, that is, the method and preferred practice of all dogmatism. I do not know whether the fact of citing in French suffices to guarantee the authenticity of a citation when it concerns a private opinion. I do not exclude the possibility that Foucault may have said such things, alas. That is a different question, which would have to be treated separately. But as he is dead, I will not in my turn cite the judgment which, as I have been told by those who were close to him, Foucault is supposed to have made concerning the practice of Searle in this case and on the act that consisted in making this use of an alleged citation a euro. In the main text he argued that Searle avoided reading him and did not try to understand him, and even that, perhaps, he was not able to understand, and how certain practices of academic politeness or impoliteness could result in a form of brutality that he disapproved of and would like to disarm, in his fashion. Much more important in terms of theoretical consequences, Derrida criticized Searle's work for pretending to talk about intention without being aware of traditional texts about the subject and without even understanding Husserl's work when talking about it. Because he ignored the tradition, he rested blindly imprisoned in it, repeating its most problematic gestures, falling short of the most elementary critical questions. Derrida would even argue that in a certain way he was more close to Austin than Searle, that, in fact, was more close to Continental philosophers that himself tried to criticize. Jacques Habermas, in the Philosophical Discourse of Modernity, Jacques Habermas criticized what he considered Derrida's opposition to rational discourse. Further, in an essay on religion and religious language, Habermas criticized Derrida's insistence on etymology and philology. Walter A. Davis, the American philosopher Walter A. Davis, in Inwardness and Existence, Subjectivity and Hegel, Heidegger, Marx and Freud, argues that both deconstruction and structuralism are prematurely arrested moments of a dialectical movement that issues in Hegelian unhappy consciousness. In popular media, Popular criticism of deconstruction also intensified following the Sokol affair, which many people took as an indicator of the quality of deconstruction as a whole, despite the absence of Derrida from Sokol's follow-up book Impostures Intellectuals. See also, List of deconstructionists, hermeneutics, poststructuralism, postmodernism, notes. References: Derrida, Jacques, 1967. Of Grammatology, trans. By Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak. Baltimore and London, Johns Hopkins University Press. ISBN 978-0-8018-5830-7, Derrida, Jacques. Speech and Phenomena and Other Essays on Husserl's Theory of Signs. Trans. David B. Allison. Evanston, Northwestern UP, 1973. ISBN 978-0-8101-0590-4. Derrida, Jacques. Positions. Trans. Alan Buss. Chicago, U of Chicago P., 1981. ISBN 978-0-226-14331-6, Derrida, 1980, The Time of a Thesis, Punctuations, first published in, Derrida, 1988, Limited Incorporated, Derrida, 1990, Eyes of the University, Right to Philosophy 2, ppA 113 128, Derrida, Jacques, 1983, Letter to a Japanese Friend, Inwood, David and Bernasconi, Robert Derrida and Differ Copyright Rants, Warwick, Farauzia, 1985, Klein, Anne Carolyn, Meeting the Great Bliss Queen, Buddhists, Feminists, and the Art of the Self. Boston, Beacon, 1995. ISBN 978-0-8070-7306-3. Montefiore, Alain, Philosophy in France Today Cambridge, Cambridge UP, ppA 34 €50, Moynihan, Robert, Recent Imagining, Interviews with Harold Bloom, Jeffrey Hartman, Paul de Man, J. Hillis Miller. Shoestring, 1986. ISBN 978-0-208-02120-5. Rorty, Richard, From Formalism to Post-Structuralism. The Cambridge History of Literary Criticism, Volume 8. Cambridge, Cambridge UP, 1995. Further reading. External links, The Dictionary Definition of Deconstruction at Wiktionary, video of Jacques Derrida attempting to define deconstruction, Deconstruction in Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Deconstruction in Stanford Presidential Lectures in the Humanities and Arts, Deconstruction in Encyclopedia Britannica, Deconstructing History by Alun Munslow, Deconstruction in Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Deconstructionist Theory by Richard Rorty, German Law Journal Special Number about Derrida and Deconstruction, Critical Legal Studies Movement, and the Use of Deconstruction, Deconstruction, Some Assumptions by John Lai, A Bibliography of Literary Theory, Criticism, and Philology by Joseph Copyright Angel Garca Alanda, 10 Ways of Thinking About Deconstruction by Willie Melly, Archive of the International Conference Deconstructing Mimesis, Philippe Lecoq-Labarthe about the work of Lecoq-Labarthe and his mimetic version of deconstruction, held at the Sorbonne in January 2006, How to Deconstruct Almost Anything, My Postmodern Adventure by Chip Morningstar. A cynical introduction to deconstruction from the perspective of a software engineer. Jacques Derrida, The Perchance of a Coming of the Other Woman. The Deconstruction of Phallogocentrism from Dual to Duo by Carol Daly, English translation by Wilson Baldridge, at Sens Public, Ellen Lupton on Deconstruction in Graphic Design, Deconstruction of Fashion. La Moda en la Postmodernidad by Adolfo Vázquez Roca, An Alternative Look at Deconstruction, from a Perspective of Its Use in Popular Culture.